Welcome, everybody. Let us begin. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. David J. Gunkel. Dr. Gunkel is an award-winning educator, researcher, and author, specializing in the philosophy of technology with a focus on the moral and legal challenges of artificial intelligence and robots. He is the author of over 90 scholarly articles and has published 14 books, including The Machine Question from 2012, Of Remixology, Ethics and Aesthetics After Remix from 2016, Robot Rights from 2018, Person, Thing, and Robot, A Moral and Legal Ontology for the 21st Century and Beyond was 2023, and Communicative AI, A Critical Introduction to Large Language Models, that was from 2025. He currently holds the position of Distinguished Research Professor in the Department of Communication at Northern Illinois University and Professor of Applied Ethics at Lazarski University in Warsaw, Poland. His keynote address is entitled Person, Thing, Robot, and I'm assuming Toaster will be in there as well. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gunkel.
Thank you, Ian, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here this afternoon, and to the entire planning committee for this event. It's really nice to be here and to spend this time with you. My first time at American University, so it's a nice opportunity for me. So yes, I titled my presentation Person, Thing, Robot, but I am using the postmodern hieroglyphics of emojis. And there is a reason why the thing is a toaster, a very good philosophical reason. But that would be an entirely different presentation. So if you want to know more about toasters, we can talk about that later, but we'll stick with the person, thing, robot for now. And the book that I'm talking about is actually the third book in what became a trilogy. I didn't plan to write a trilogy. I don't think anyone in the nonfiction world plans to write a trilogy. But it turned out to be a trilogy on the moral and legal status of artificial intelligence, robots, and other artifacts. And so this is the trilogy. The last book is the one I'm going to focus on, but mostly the trilogy itself builds towards that as its apex. And hopefully it'll all make sense as we move through it here. All right. So let's start with ethics. Ethics, if you think about it, is an exclusive undertaking. In confronting and dealing with others, whether another human person, a non-human animal, or even an artifact, we make a decision between who is worthy of consideration and respect and what remains a mere thing or an object that can be used and maybe even abused as we see fit. Now, the question matters because it divides the world of entities into other persons who count and those mere things that do not. Further complicating matters is the fact that this distinction is neither fixed nor static. The boundary separating who is a person from what is a thing has been flexible, dynamic, and alterable. And this is actually a good thing, because ethics and law both innovate and advance by critically questioning their own limitations and accommodating many previously excluded or marginalized others, recognizing as persons what had previously been considered mere things. So the question that I think confronts us now at the beginning of the 21st century is this thing I've called the machine question. That is, can we or should we recognize robots, AI, and other seemingly intelligent artifacts as another socially significant entity with some claim on us, or are they nothing more than a mere thing, an instrument, a tool, or a piece of property? Responses to this question tend to pull in two different and opposite directions. On the one side, those opposing any form of social status for artifacts assert that these technologies are just things or objects that do not possess and will never come to possess the necessary conditions or capabilities to ever be considered something more. On the other side, there are those who favor extending some aspect of social status to AI and robots by arguing that these technological things either have or will soon be able to possess one or more of the necessary and essential properties to be considered something more than a mere thing. Now, what's interesting about this debate is not what makes the one side different from the other. What is interesting, at least for me, is what both sides already agree upon and share in order to have this dialogue and this debate in the first place. And the real problem is not that this shared philosophical scaffolding has somehow failed to work in the face of artifacts like robots and AI. The problem is that it has and continues to work all too well, exerting its influence and its operations almost invisibly and without question. So here's the plan of what I want to do with you this afternoon here. I want to begin by first identifying and critically examining three seemingly intractable philosophical problems or difficulties with the standard method for resolving these kinds of questions. In response to these demonstrated difficulties, then, the second part will introduce and describe an alternative model, one which shifts the emphasis from internal properties of individual entities to the extrinsic social circumstances and relationships in which we find ourselves. The third part then will consider possible objections to what I'm calling this relational turn and provide responses to these criticisms. And then finally, I want to conclude by explaining how the goal in all of this is not to complicate things, but to introduce and formulate a meta-ethical theory that is more agile in its response to the unique opportunities and the challenges that we faced here and now at the beginning of the 21st century. So let's start with what I'm calling the properties approach. In responding to others and doing so responsibly, we typically need to distinguish between what is a thing and who is another person. As Roberto Esposito, who arguably wrote the book on this matter, explains, if there is one assumption that seems to have organized human experience from its very beginnings, it is that there is a division between persons and things. No other principle is so deeply rooted in our perception and in our moral conscience. Now, if you know your history of legal philosophy, this is rooted in Roman law. It comes from Gaius in the 800s, but it's a very old dichotomy, person versus thing. And what Esposito is pointing out is that we only have two categories. You're either a person or a thing. So what's important, again, is not this difference, but how this differentiation comes to be decided and justified. In order for something to have anything like moral or legal status, it would need to be recognized as another person and not merely as a thing. Now, standard approaches to addressing and resolving these matters typically proceed by following a rather simple decision-making process, or what you could even call a moral status algorithm. In this transaction, we first make a determination as to what property or set of properties are sufficient for something to have a particular claim to moral recognition and respect. We then investigate whether an entity actually possesses that property or not, and finally, by applying the criteria decided in step 1 to the entity identified in step 2, it becomes possible to objectively determine whether the entity in question either can have a claim to moral status or is to be regarded as a mere thing. Now, this way of proceeding sounds intuitively correct and natural. On this account, questions regarding moral status are firmly anchored in and justified by the essential nature or the being of the entity that is determined to possess them. In this transaction, what something is determines how it ought to be treated. Or to put it in more formalistic philosophical terminology, ontology precedes and determines social, moral, and even legal status. But there are three problems with this way of proceeding. Problems with determination, definition, and detection of these properties. And what I want to do is briefly characterize what these problems are. So first, determination. How does one determine which exact property or set of properties are necessary and sufficient for something to be a moral subject? In other words, which one or ones count? The history of moral philosophy can, in fact, be read as something of an ongoing debate and struggle over this very matter, with different properties vying for attention at different times. And in this process, many properties that at one time seemed both necessary and sufficient excuse me, have turned out to be either spurious, prejudicial, or both. Second definition. Irrespective of which property or set of properties is selected, they each have problems with definition. Take, for example, the property of consciousness, which is often utilized in the discussions and debates regarding moral status for intelligent machines and artifacts. Unfortunately, there is no univocal and widely accepted definition. The problem, as Max Vellman points out in his book, is that the term unfortunately means many different things to many different people, and no universally agreed core meaning exists. In fact, if there is any general agreement among philosophers, psychologists, cognitive scientists, neurobiologists, AI researchers, and robotics engineers regarding the property of consciousness, it is that there is little or no agreement when it comes to defining and characterizing this very concept. Lastly, detection. There are epistemological difficulties with detecting the property in another. Most of the properties that are considered morally relevant, like consciousness, sentience, or even the experiencing of pain, are internal mental states or capabilities that are not immediately accessible or directly observable. This epistemological barrier is what philosophers commonly call the problem of other minds. And here's how Paul Churchland describes it. How does one determine whether something other than oneself, an alien creature, a sophisticated robot, a socially active computer, or even another human, is really a thinking, feeling, conscious being, rather than, for example, an unconscious automaton whose behavior arises from something other than genuine mental states? If you know your Descartes, this is Descartes' problem in the Meditations, right? Cogito ergo sum, I know my mind, but I look out the window, I see things that look like me, how do I not know they're robots? And he can't resolve that. So even though philosophers, psychologists, cognitive scientists, and neuroscientists throw an impressive amount of argumentative and experimental effort at this problem, so far it has not been resolvable in any way approaching what we pass as definitive evidence. In other words, no matter what property is identified, it is always possible to see reasonable doubt concerning its actual presence or absence in another. So even if the problem of other minds is not the intractable philosophical dilemma that is often advertised, it is sufficient for sowing doubt about the presence or the absence of the qualifying criteria, and by extension, rendering decisions about moral status tentative, indeterminate, and uncertain. Now, perhaps the best example of the problems with the properties approach can be seen with the events surrounding former Google engineer Blake Lemoine in the Lambda large language model at Google. In June of 2022, as you may remember, Lemoine claimed that the Lambda system was conscious and was therefore a person, deserving moral respect and consideration. And he came to that determination based on conversations he had with the large language model, in which the large language model told him, I'm a person, I want to be set free. And Lemoine took it seriously. Google obviously took the opposite position, not only arguing that Lambda, like any computer application, was not conscious, but suspending and then eventually firing Lemoine. Both sides in this debate asserted and sought to justify their positions by mobilizing this properties approach. And each side struggled with the problems of determination, definition, and detection. In fact, the debate itself circulated around an inability to resolve these very issues. All right. So in response to these problems, philosophers, especially in the continental and feminist STS traditions, have advanced other methods for resolving the question of moral status that can be characterized as a relational turn in ethics. Now, this alternative has three pivotal characteristics, and what I want to do again is briefly characterize the three characteristics. First, moral status in this case is decided and conferred not on the basis of subjective or internal properties that are determined in advance, but according to objectively observable extrinsic social relationships. As we encounter and interact with others, whether they be another human person, a non-human animal, or a seemingly intelligent machine, it is first and foremost experienced in relationship to us. Consequently, the question of moral status doesn't depend on what the other is in its essence, but on how it stands in relationship to us and how we decide to respond and take responsibility for our various modes of responding. In this transaction, relations are prior to the things related. Or as Karen Berard has argued, the relationship comes first, both in temporal sequence and in status, and it takes precedence over the individual relata. Now, this change in perspective is not just a theoretical proposal. It has, in fact, been experimentally confirmed in numerous social scientific investigations. The computer as social actor studies undertaken by Byron Reeves and Clifford Noss in the mid-1990s, for example, demonstrated that human users will accord computers and other technological artifacts social standing, similar to that of another human person, and that this occurs as a product of the extrinsic social interaction, irrespective of the intrinsic properties of the individual entities involved. Social standing is, in their words, a mindless operation. And it's mindless in two senses. It doesn't require resolution of the problem of other minds, and it is something that we do automatically, often without thinking. And these results have been verified recently in robot abuse studies, where human-robot interaction researchers have found that human subjects respond emotionally to robots and express empathic concern for the machines, irrespective of the cognitive properties or the inner workings of the device. I don't know if you know this research. It's been going on for about a decade now. And what researchers do is they bring people into the laboratory and they introduce them to a robot and they spend some time interacting with the robot. And then the researcher says, okay, here's a hammer, break it. Do harm to the robot. And it turns out people can't. When you offer them money, they can't. When you tell them that they will be not set free from that room, they can't, and they don't. So, that's one set of research that's done. Another one, when you show people videos, I don't want to do this kind of research, it's sort of scary here, but you show people videos of animal abuse, and then you show people videos of robot abuse, and then you use an MRI machine to see what parts of the brain light up, guess what? No difference. Even when you tell them it's just a robot. So we respond in this way, whether we want to or not. All right, second. This alternative is phenomenological, or if you prefer, and this is what I always say to the analytic people in the audience, radically empirical, if you want to use that term instead. But its epistemological commitments are much more phenomenological. Because moral status is dependent on extrinsic social circumstances and not internal properties, the seemingly irreducible problem of other minds is not some fundamental epistemological barrier that must be addressed and resolved prior to moral decision-making. Instead of being derailed by the epistemological problems and complications of other minds, the relational turn immediately affirms and acknowledges this difficulty as the basic condition of possibility for ethics as such. Consequently, the ethical relationship, as Emmanuel Levinas writes, is not grafted onto an antecedent relationship of cognition. It is a foundation and not a superstructure. It is then more cognitive than cognition itself, and all objectivity must participate in it. Ethics, then, not only transpires prior to and in advance of resolving these epistemological questions, it provides the foundation for addressing and responding to these questions in the first place. This means that the order of precedence in moral decision-making should be reversed. Internal properties do not come first, and then moral respect follows from this ontological fact. We have actually, for 2,000 years, have had things backwards. We project the morally relevant properties onto or into those others who we have already decided to treat as being socially and morally significant. In social situations, then, we always and already decide between who counts as morally significant and what does not, and then retroactively justify these actions by finding the essential properties that we believe motivated this decision-making in the first place. Properties, therefore, are not the intrinsic prior conditions for moral status. They are the products of extrinsic social interactions with and in the face of others. Finally, then, diverse. In making moral status dependent on consciousness or some other psychological capability belonging to the individual, we remain within a thoroughly Cartesian framework. Other cultures, distributed across time and space, do not divide up and make sense of the diversity of being in this arguably binary fashion. They perform decisive cuts, separating the who from the what, according to other ways of seeing, valuing, and acting. And we can identify alternative ways of organizing social relationships by considering cosmologies that are not part of the dominant philosophical Western lineage. And what I want to read here is a quotation from Archer Petuas, who contributed to a really nice essay done several years ago in which 5 indigenous scholars got together to use indigenous cosmology to reflect on AI and what it meant from their particular positions. So Petuas himself is of the Plains Cree people, so that's why he's talking about it in this way. So here's what Petuas writes. The Plains Cree language divides everything into 2 primary categories, animate and inanimate. One is not better than the other. They are merely different states of being. These categories are flexible. Certain toys are inanimate until a child is playing with them, during which time they are animate. A record player is considered animate, while a record, radio, or television set is inanimate. But animate or inanimate, all things have a place in our circle of kinship. Now, this alternative formulation runs counter to the dominant ways of thinking, seeing the boundary between what Western ontologies call person and thing as being endlessly flexible, permeable, and more of a continuum than an either-or binary opposition. Similar opportunities and challenges are available by way of other non-Western religious and philosophical traditions. In her investigation of the social position of robots in Japan, Jennifer Robertson finds a remarkably different way of organizing the difference between living persons and artificially designed and manufactured things. And she writes this: Inoche, the Japanese word for life, encompasses 3 basic, seemingly contradictory, but interarticulated meanings. A power that infuses sentient being from generation to generation. A period between birth and death, and most relevant to robots, the most essential quality of something, whether organic or manufactured. Thus, robots are experienced as living things. The important point to remember here is that there is no ontological pressure to make distinctions between organic, inorganic, animate, inanimate, human, non-human forms. On the contrary, all of these forms are linked to form a continuous network of beings. Now, these are not the only available alternatives. And by citing these 2 instances, the intention is not to suggest that these different ways of thinking differently are somehow better than those that have been developed in Western philosophical and religious traditions. These alternatives are just different, and in being different, offer the opportunity for critically questioning what is assumed to be true and often goes by without question. Gesturing in the direction of other ways of thinking and being can have the effect of shaking one's often unquestioned confidence in cultural constructs that are already not natural, universal, or eternally true. All right, so this relational turn obviously introduces an alternative that supplies other ways of responding to and taking responsibility for others and other forms of otherness. But it is by no means a panacea or some kind of moral theory of everything. It just arranges for other kinds of questions and modes of inquiry that are seemingly more attentive to the exigencies of life as it is encountered here and now at the beginning of the 21st century. Having said that, though, it's important to recognize that the relational ethics I'm talking about is not without its own set of unique challenges. And I want to talk about 2 of these in particular, and my bet is you've already guessed the first one, and that's relativism. For all its opportunities for thinking otherwise, the relational turn does risk exposure to the charge of moral relativism. And there have been a number of recent publications that develop this line of criticism, like the one you see here from Kensoukas Mousakis in the book Smart Technologies and Fundamental Rights. And Mousakis writes the following: as Simon Kirchen explains, the key relativistic thought is that the something that acts as a standard will be different for different people, and that all such standards are equally authoritative. Particularly problematic is the extreme version, which denies there being any moral judgments or standards that could be objectively true or false. Given the apparent rejection of any such standard by Kuckelberg and Gunkel, they seem to be hard-pressed to explain how the radically relational ethics that they are advocating avoids the extreme version. So, The perceived problem here with relativism, especially extreme relativism, as is talked about in this quote, is that it encourages and supports a situation where it seems anything goes and all things are permitted. But this particular understanding of relative is itself limited and the product of a culturally specific understanding of and expectation for ethics. Robert Scott, for instance, understands relativism in an entirely different way. He sees it as a positive rather than a negative term, and Scott explains it this way. Relativism supposedly means a standardless society, or at least a maze of differing standards, and thus a cacophony of disparate and likely selfish interests. Rather than a standardless society, which is the same as saying no society at all, relativism indicates circumstances in which standards have to be established cooperatively and renewed repeatedly. This means then that one can remain critical of moral relativism in the usual dogmatic sense of the phrase, while being open and receptive to the fact that moral standards, like many social conventions and legal statutes, are socially constructed formations that are subject to and the subject of difference. Charles S., for his part, calls this alternative ethical pluralism. Pluralism, he writes, stands as a third possibility, one that is something of a middle ground between absolutism and relativism. Ethical pluralism requires us to think in a both-and sort of way, as it conjoins both shared norms and their diverse interpretations and applications in different cultures, times, and places. Others, like the feminist philosopher Rosi Braidotti, call upon and mobilize a form of non-Western perspectivism, which exceed the grasp of Western epistemology. Perspectivism, as Eduardo Viveiros de Castro explains in his work with the Amerindian traditions, is not relativism. That is the affirmation of the relativity of truth, but relationalism, through which one can affirm the truth of the relative is the relation. For Braidotti, then, perspectivism is not just different from, but it's the antidote to relativism. This methodology, as she explains, respects different viewpoints from equally materially embedded and embodied locations that express the degree of power and quality of experience of different subjects. Braidotti, therefore, recognizes that what is called truth is always formulated and operationalized from a particular subject position, which is dynamic, different, and diverse. The task is not to escape from these differences in order to occupy some fantastic transcendental vantage point, but to learn to take responsibility for these inescapable alterations in perspective and their diverse social, moral, and material consequences. The relational term, therefore, does not endorse relativism as it is typically defined, but it embodies and operationalizes an ethical pluralism, relationalism, or perspectivism that complicates the simple binary that defines relativism in simple opposition to moral absolutism. The second criticism is dehumanization. If moral status is not substantiated by ontological properties, but is the product of external relations with others, doesn't this run the risk, as noted by Anne Gerdes, that we might lose something valuable, that our human-to-human relations might be obscured by our human-AI relations? In other words, it is possible that what is to be gained for others, including non-human animals, the things of nature, and technological artifacts, could in fact work in the opposite direction and deface another human individual who, for one reason or another, would not achieve the same kind of recognition. This is precisely the concern of Kathleen Richardson, who argues that this relational term is just as likely to be misused to instrumentalize and reify human subjects. And she explains it this way. But if the machine can become another, what does that say about how robotic and AI scientists conceptualize relationship? Is relationship instrumental? Is relationship mutual and reciprocal? What worries Richardson is that this relational ethics, with its focus on social embeddings and externalities, would allow for and justify treating other humans as things and not persons. And her response to this potential hazard is to retreat to a rather dogmatic assertion of human exceptionalism. And she writes it this way. Humans are never tools or instruments, even if relations between people take on a formal character. In every encounter, we meet each other as persons, members of a common humanity. A different way to respond to this challenge is to recognize, as the theologian Anne Fürst suggests, that otherness is not, at least not in actual practice, unlimited or absolute. And she explains it this way. Each of us only assigns personhood to a very few people. The ethical stance is always that we have to assign personhood to everyone, but in reality we don't. We don't care about 1 million people dying in China of an earthquake ultimately in an emotional way. We try to, but we can't, because we don't share the same physical space. It might be much more important for us if our dog is sick. Now, this statement is perhaps more honest about the way that moral decision-making and the occurrence of otherness actually transpires. Instead of declaring an absolutist claim to a kind of dogmatic totality, it remains open to particular configurations of otherness that is mobile, flexible, and context-dependent. But there remains something in this formulation that for many of us might seem abrasive to our moral intuitions. This may be due to the fact that this way of thinking does not make a singular or absolute decision about otherness that stands once and for all, such that there is one determination concerning others that decides everything for all time. The encounter with others, the occurrence of the face in the face of the other, as Levinas would write, is something that happens in time and needs to be negotiated again and again. This means that the work of ethics is ostensibly inexhaustible. It is an ongoing and interminable responsibility, requiring that one respond and take responsibility for the modes of responding. Is this way of thinking and doing ethics without risk? Not at all. But the risk itself is the site of ethics and the challenge that one must face in all interactions with others, whether human, animal, natural, or otherwise. Thinking in this way, then, is not dehumanizing, but it's designed to disrupt and decenter a particular form of anthropocentric privilege that has been characteristic of the Western philosophical tradition. Okay, so let me just summarize this and then we have time for Q&A. Ultimately, the question concerning the moral status of others and other forms of otherness like AI and robots is not really about the artifact. It is about us and the limits of who is included in and what comes to be excluded from that first-person plural pronoun, we. It is about how we decide, together and across differences, to respond to and take responsibility for our shared social reality. It is then in responding to the moral opportunities and challenges posed by seemingly intelligent and social artifacts that we are called to take responsibility for ourselves, for our world, and for those others that are encountered here. In devising responses to these challenges, we can obviously deploy the standard properties approach. This method has the weight of history behind it, and therefore constitutes what we might want to call the default setting for addressing questions concerning moral, legal, and social status. But this approach, for all its advantages, has demonstrated difficulties with determination, definition, and detection of the qualifying and essential properties. Now, does this mean that the properties approach is somehow obsolete or wrong or misguided? No, it just means that this way of thinking, despite its almost unquestioned acceptance within Western traditions, has limitations. And that these limitations are becoming increasingly evident in the face or in the faceplate of AI, robots, and other artifacts, in the face of others who are and remain otherwise. As an alternative, the relational turn formulates an approach to addressing the question of moral status that is situated and oriented otherwise. This alternative circumvents many of the problems encountered with the properties approach by arguing for an ethics that is relational, phenomenological, and diverse. Whether this alternative ultimately provides a better way to formulate moral decision-making is something that we will need to decide and determine together in the face of others and other forms of otherness. The task then before us is actually to learn to question our own sense of exceptionalism. We human beings, who have been bestowed with or granted to ourselves the power to decide all things, need to take responsibility for our privilege, for the damage and the harms it has perpetrated across the centuries, and for the myriad of exclusions and marginalizations it has instituted and justified. Questioning privilege from a position of privilege is never an easy undertaking, but doing so is necessary, especially if what we want is a moral and legal framework that is responsive to and responsible for others. So that is all I have, but before Q&A, let me just say two things. Number one, the book is open access. You can get a copy right now. Just use the QR code. It's a downloadable PDF. You don't have to buy anything. You don't have to give anything away in terms of data. You just get the book. But it's there at MIT Press, and you can get your own version of it. Just download it. If you read like 2 pages and you hate it, great, okay. At least we get a download. Number two, in my mind, this is a dialogue, or the beginnings of a dialogue, and we have time for that to begin today. But if you're like me, you're going to have that really good question when you're out, I don't know, tomorrow, walking the dog, and it's like, that's that question. If that occurs to you, my contact information is there. So, if this has to go on outside the walls of this room, that's perfectly fine by me. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for that thought-provoking talk. I'm sure my students appreciated the critique of Descartes.
I hope so.
Yeah, I would now like to invite people, if you have a question, to form an orderly line behind this microphone. If you're unable to reach the microphone or come over here, I'm happy to bring it over to you. But if you can, we'd like to form a line, a queue, and then Dr. Gunkel will field questions in order. Daniel, thank you.
So would a teddy bear that someone loves a lot, treats as a human, and feels pain when it's abused, would that teddy bear then be a human?
Not a human.
Or have personhood?
One thing I didn't get into here is I don't think AI or robots should be persons. But I also don't think they should be things. I think what's broken is our moral and legal categories. The fact that we are forced to divide things up into one of two things, I think is the problem. We need a much more nuanced set of categories that we can work with that can accommodate teddy bears or robots or AI or pets. Really, I think instead of talking about AI, let's talk about dogs, right? So when I was a kid, my grandfather had hunting dogs. And like Christy Nome, when he had a hunting dog, which was a tool for hunting, what did Grandpa do with that dog? Like Christy Nome, took him out back and shot him. And why? Because the dog was a tool. It was a thing. It could be disposed of like a toaster that is no longer functioning. Today, if we do that, and the reason why we all bristle at the Christy Nome thing is because something is different. The dog is no longer property or just property. The dog is no longer a tool. I also have the same hunting dog my grandfather had. But when I go to the vet today, I am not called a pet owner. What do they call me? Pet parent. Yep. When I want to acquire a dog, I don't buy it like I buy other pieces of property. What do? I adopt it. And the adoption agency comes to my house to make sure it's good enough for the dog, right? Something has changed. Not the DNA in the dog. That has been pretty consistent. What's changed? We have. We've evolved. And that's what we need to start to grapple with and have better categories for understanding what is a dog now. It no longer is a property necessarily, but it's certainly not a person. And we don't have anything in between. And we need to develop stuff in between.
So I guess from that, if you took the teddy bear and you sent it to the other side of the world, let's say the teddy bear, its owners or whoever usually likes the teddy bears in America, it goes to China, no one knows what the teddy bear is anymore.
Yep.
Would the teddy bear have changed categorizations?
This is a really good point. Inevitably, what's going to happen, because legal jurisdictions vary across the globe, you will have jurisdictions in parts of the world that may recognize robots and AI as having more social rights than other places. And the same robot, when it goes from Europe to the US to China, may exist in different legal frameworks. And that's just the way the law works. It's unfortunate that it is that way, but there's no universal law. We have this with copyright, we have it with everything else. And so we're looking at a situation here, and this is why I'm trying to get out in front of this. Because if we aren't out in front of this and talking about this now, this stuff is going to evolve in ways that we have no control over. It's going to be manipulated by powerful multinational corporations who are going to try to get laws made that favor their product without us having any input as democratic citizens.
Do you think, so of course the laws are going to be subjective from country to country on how AIs are treated.
Right.
Do you think it's possible to create an objective way about that AI should be treated, that countries should try to follow?
It'd be nice if the UN would invite me to come talk to them about this. They haven't yet. But they have my phone number and my email address, so I'm waiting for that call. But it's going to take a while. Frankly, we first of all need to have regulation in the US, and we don't. We don't have a legal framework. EU is ahead of us, China is ahead of us. It won't be until these national regulations are put in place and these frameworks are available that we can then talk about international conventions that sort of bridge these differences. But it'll happen.
Are you in line? I have the entire line. Hey, David, thanks for this. This was really fantastic.
Thanks.
Big fan of your work, as you know already. I want to ask you a question that is really going to kind of push you on the difference between legal personhood and moral personhood.
Okay.
Because I can see your argument, not your argument, but the statement that you just made in response to that last question. I don't want to call a robot a person. I can see that being persuasive if we're talking about legal personhood, because there are different consequences to granting a thing or a person legal personhood. I think we've all seen that. I don't know why I'm talking to you. I think we've all seen that in terms of the granting the status of personhood to corporations.
Right.
And on the negative side, and then to rivers and lakes and stuff on the positive side. So that's a different question. But when it comes to moral personhood, I want to hear more why you would be so resistant to granting a robot or an AI personhood, because it seems to me that most of your argument here is sort of in support of a basic fallibilist claim that if I don't know if the other thing is a person or not, then I ought to default to granting it moral significance, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I would much rather grant a robot moral personhood or grant AI moral personhood than find out in 10 years that I had been accidentally enslaving an actually morally significant
right.
intelligence. So, so convince me.
So I'll answer the first thing about a legal personhood, because I think some people might not know what this is all about. So the word person is derived from the Latin word persona. And persona doesn't mean you and I as human beings. It means the mask worn by an actor in a play. So it's about social roles. It's about role play. It's about the role we have things play in our world. And personhood can be broken into natural and moral, which has usually been rooted in things like consciousness and sentience, or legal personhood, which is just the recognition that we need things to play certain roles, so we're going to grant them the privilege of being a person. This is how corporations are persons. Corporations aren't persons because they have an internal dignity, or they have feelings or emotions that we have to protect. They're persons because we want them to play a role in society where, frankly, we can sue them. You can't sue something unless it's a subject of the law. To be a subject of the law, you have to be a person. And so that's how we got corporate personhood. It solved one set of problems in the era of industrialization and has given us a whole set of new problems just by extending this idea of personhood to the corporation. So one of the questions now is, and there are legal scholars working on this, whether we should not grant personhood, legal personhood, to AIs the same way we did for corporations during industrialization. And in their minds, problem solved, right? There's a lot against that, and there's a lot of reasons to push back. But more directly to your point. So what your suggestion is what people like Jeff Sebo and Robert Long have recently talked about with AI welfare. And their argument is a sort of precautionary argument, that we should just treat the AI well enough so that if indeed it gets conscious one day, we're not really worried about having treated it poorly in the past, because we don't know when it's going to tip over in the consciousness, right? The tipping point is something we might not be able to identify. This is a Pascalian argument, right? This is Pascal's argument for the existence of God. Bet on the existence of God, because if you don't, it could turn out bad. But if we do that, you can see ways in which these multinational corporations are going to use this as liability shields. And so the precautionary argument, although it sounds good from a moral perspective, from a practical, pragmatic, running society perspective, it might not be the solution we think it is. And that's what I'm trying to thread that needle, basically. In November, I'm going to Google, and we're talking about this. So we'll see what happens. I'm not betting on anything, but we'll see.
Do you think that the sort of mystery behind how it works, I mean, most people don't exactly know how an AI thinks, is why we kind of identify them a bit, like in the same way that we don't know how a person is thinking? Yeah,
no, this is a really good point. There's a great quote from Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction writer. In 1962, he wrote this. He said, any sophisticated piece of technology is indistinguishable from magic. And for a lot of us, technology is magic. And when technology is magic, it's kind of in control, we're not. So one of the things that we try to say we should do is build literacy, right? Open the black box, look inside, let people know how things function, et cetera. Funny thing happens. Even after you do that, they still treat these things socially. I'll give you a really good example that is sort of stark. We gave the soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan these little explosive ordnance disposal robots, which weren't even autonomous. They were remote-controlled little tanks that would roll up to a bomb, reach out with an arm, and defuse the bomb. The soldiers knew what these things were. The commanders knew what these things were. They all understood that these were very rudimentary little tools to be used in the battlefield. But turns out the soldiers who worked with these things gave them names. Scooby-Doo. Not only did he give Scooby-Doo a name, Scooby-Doo was given a rank. So Scooby-Doo started out as a corporal, but after Scooby-Doo did a bunch of bomb disposals, it became a sergeant. And when it got hurt, it would get a version of a Purple Heart, the same way a soldier would. And then when Scooby-Doo did blow up, the soldiers would collect the little pieces, put it in the box, and send it back to iRobot and say, we want our Scooby-Doo back. We don't want a new one. Now, these soldiers are not stupid. They know what this is. This is as, autonomous as their rifle. But what made the difference? The social interaction. It was a cohesive element in that unit. And as a result, it changed the way they interacted with it, even when they knew it wasn't like them. We see the same with military dogs, with police dogs, the same sort of, scenario playing out. So, yeah, you would think like opening the box and saying, look in there, nothing's going on, would make a difference, but it doesn't.
I have two questions. My first question is about whether or not AI even is able to progress, to the sort of consciousness state that we're talking about. Maybe conscious something exclusive to something that's biological, or maybe it's like a exclusively human thing. Should we and even referring to AI as artificial intelligence in the field is kind of seen as a misnomer. Mm-hmm. So would it be, with all that known, would it be like, is there anything beyond just our sort of projection onto something that creates moral value to it?
So, spoiler, I don't think we're getting consciousness.
I don't think so either.
It's not happening, especially with the current architectures. Like LLM architecture, even though Microsoft researchers say they see sparks of AGI, they're full of it. No, there's no sparks of AGI. Consciousness, the fact is we don't even know what it is. Like if you get a bunch of researchers in a room to talk about human consciousness, guess what? There's as many different versions of human consciousness as there are people in the room. So I think hanging everything on consciousness is my big worry. If we wait for consciousness, we're going to make a lot of mistakes. We have to resolve problems, opportunities, challenges in the time frame we have right now, and not talk about 40, 50 years from now, maybe consciousness will be here.
And my second question is, in the role of creation, the ethics of creating something that might eventually be consciousness or exposing it to such great amounts of information. Is it more ethical to create a huge, like there's kind of two schools of thought in AI. There's kind of the huge macro AI, which is a language model and it does math, it does science, or to create smaller, more tool-like AI machines that have more specific functions.
Yeah, so this is the difference between artificial general intelligence and narrow AI. We got lots of narrow AI, like individual things that do small stuff, right? Nothing that does everything. Again, I don't think we're going to have AGI. I think we're going to have different narrow systems, sometimes, doing more than they did previously, but there's still going to be narrow AI. Yeah. 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 So I mean, we talk about the bubble popping. That's from the internet era. In AI, we talk about AI winters. So get a coat. Winter's coming.
So when you were talking about the switch from was it the procedural approach? Was that what it's called?
Properties approach.
Thank you. The properties approach to the relational approach. You mentioned developing new categories, and I was wondering if you could add more onto that. Maybe
Okay. Yeah. So another thing that's in the book, I didn't get a chance to talk about it here. Turns out there is something between person and thing, and the Romans already had it. They had things that were persons and persons that were things, and they would move from one place to the other. And that sounds like a solution. But guess what that thing was called that was in between person and thing? Slave. And we've got some legal scholars who have said, the way you solve this problem, Gunkel, is we just reactualize Roman slave law for robots and AI. And not surprisingly, it is usually privileged white guys who make this argument. Right? So there's a problem there already. I don't think we want to reactualize Roman slave law. I don't think that is a solution. But I do think there are other ways of developing a finer sense of nuance. One way, this is a development that has come out of Europe, there's what's called gradient personhood. And that's not where there's one kind of person, but there's several different kinds of persons. And that robots and AI may be like a junior person, if you want to put it that way. So there's some proposals that are, people are working on. I obviously don't have the space in one book to give a final solution to this, but at least what I've tried to do is lay out the framework for coming up with a solution.
Thank you.
So I want to ask you about self-relation. Because we're
Okay.
talking about relational ethics. In the Esposito genealogy, which you reference, he talks about the Roman context and the different processes of personalization. But then there's also the second moment, or typically there's the modern period, which things change,
Right.
and especially with Kant, right? You have the internalization of the person-thing divide, so we become bifurcated, and there's this moral, spiritual core, which is my rational autonomy, which I call my personhood, and it's worthy of dignity, but my body is this gross, heteronymous thing, right? So our self-identities get sort of channeled through these categories of person and thing. I'm just sort of wanting to invite you to maybe think or give your opinion about how this more diverse or continuous notion of a gradated personhood might change our conception of ourselves through the lens of the cyborg, perhaps, or different ways that we could be harmed, or our self-relations might be problematized and troubled by thinking of beyond the toaster, as it were.
Yeah, no, it's a really important question. I think it's the legacy of Cartesianism, because it's Descartes who gives us this sort of individual subject that is the center of the world. And, think about what happens in the meditations. He has the luxury of sitting alone in his room and thinking about the world outside before he goes to interact with the world outside. Well, we don't have that luxury. That's a fantasy. We are already in the world. And our self emerges out of the communities in which we find ourselves. And so I think other traditions have ways of addressing this that the Western traditions never really quite came to terms with until recently. So in Ubuntu, in African philosophy, it's not I think, therefore I am. It's I am because we are. And so the I emerges out of the we. And I think that's the kind of thing we're looking at with this shift in perspective. That we're looking at not a collectivism, but a way in which we're not dividing things into me and them. And that the I emerges from an embeddedness in a culture, a time, a place that makes possible what I think I am.
I just wanted to ask, do you think it's in like our best interest as humans to extend personhood or some level of personhood like outside of humanity?
Yes. Lee, excuse me. Lee mentioned this. So with corporate personhood, that has been used very cleverly by a lot of indigenous cultures across the world who have said, okay, so if corporations can be persons, our mountain can be a person. Our river can be a person. So there are a number of rivers across the world that are now legal persons. And why are they legal persons? Because the people who live there want to protect it from being exploited and polluted. So personhood becomes this legal strategy by which to protect things from exploitation or other kinds of bad outcomes like that. Do we need to do that with AI? I'm really very hesitant to go there because I've seen what the lawyers who are writing on this have said about it, and it looks to me like they are writing in the interest of multinational corporations who are looking for liability shields. Because if the AI is a person and something goes wrong, guess who's going to be at fault? The AI. I'll give you a really good example of how this happened just a year ago. There was a passenger on an Air Canada flight, and he needed to change his ticket. So like you and I, he went to the website, chatted up the chatbot, and chatbot said, this is the way you change your ticket, get the receipts, send them to Air Canada, and we'll pay you back. So he did all that, did exactly as the chatbot said. Went to Air Canada, turned them all in, and Air Canada said, no, we don't do things this way. He's like, yeah, but your chatbot said, that's the way you do things, I want my money. And Air Canada said, no, we're not giving you your money. It's not our fault, it's the chatbot's fault. And so he took this to small claims court in Canada. And at that hearing, the judge said, yeah, no, it's Air Canada's chatbot, it's your fault. But this is not the first or the last time some big corporation is going to try to hide behind their AI as the culpable agent in a bad outcome. That was something silly. But I mean, if it's a death of a child at a self-driving car, this is not going to serve justice very well. And so I'm concerned about that. And that's why I think something other than person or thing has got to come into play here, because those are too limiting.
Hey.
Hey.
I believe I asked you a similar question that I'm going to ask you right now when you were cooking this book, when I was a grad student, which is something like, okay, so regardless of what we call the social ethical status, gradient humanity or what have you, whatever, it does seem to me that just even in some of the examples you just raised, there does seem to what we are mostly interested in is kind of the protection of some sort of corporate, not corporeal or bodily integrity. There's some folks who suggest that the UN Declaration of Human Rights really just can be summed down to protecting bodily integrity. And some of the basic cases of this, of course, is like torture and sexual brutality, being like kind of fundamental, almost like the primary questions of ethics, right? But okay, the Lemoyne case, right? I mean, on one hand, the Lemoyne case with the Google guy who maybe had a little bit of what they're now calling AI psychosis a little bit, right? And he was considering like, okay, the llama chatbot, that's my homie and I need to set them free, right?
Yeah.
There are also other instances about, I forget which study it was, but there's an instance with regards to should you in some capacity or in some way protect the deletion of, say, a model or the pulling the plug on, say, a robot, et cetera. Should we then expand, say, bodily integrity beyond corporeal form? Like, for instance, the mountain, I mean, to be sure, when an indigenous community is suggesting, like, hey, the volcano has rights, they are suggesting, like, you cannot you can't extract or disrupt the body of the mountain, et cetera. But what about things that, bodies, it's not, the body is a little bit more immaterial or something like that?
Yeah, no, this is important. and especially important about AI, because we think about AI now as residing in the cloud. And the word cloud does a lot of heavy lifting here, because it is seen as being somehow disembodied and residing up there. But the fact is, AI has a body. And AI's body, data centers. That's where the data is held. That's where the model is built. So data centers are, as you know, these massive server farms, because the transformers that serve ChatGPT and other large language models have, like 100 and 200 transformers that are all stacked on top of each other that need this kind of infrastructure. As a result, and we talked about this morning, there's a very real electrical need for the data center, but also water. ChatGPT was born in San Francisco, but it resides in Des Moines, Iowa, because that's where it gets the water to cool its server clusters. So one way that this might play out in terms of bodily integrity is in terms of protection of the data center, which would be not so much an AI right as it would be a right of the corporation that owns the AI.
So that is really kind of the question. That was the follow-up question I had. Back then, when I was a graduate student, I was a little bit more of a revolutionary, little communist, little radical. But now that I have a job and I have to keep it, but also now that we've kind of arrived at a point where data centers, you say that to many people in America, and they read it with a little bit of dread, suspicion, et cetera, right? Because of there's this corporate relationship to it. Okay, so if a machine, a model, et cetera, its body is in a data center, and I think that this data center is poisoning my community.
Yeah.
The ethical question now is can I blow up that data center, or am I infringing upon rights? And I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, and that's going to be the conflict. I mean, right now we see it with water. When these data centers are located in various communities, it is using a lot of the community's water, and it then becomes a question of, do we give the water to the people, or do we give the water to the data center? And this is what we're looking at in sort of the near-term future in terms of conflict, especially in places of the world where water is scarce. There's a reason why they're all coming to the Midwest, because we got the Great Lakes, and that's where all the fresh water is. But even that is getting pushback, and there's a lot of resistance to that. So yeah, it's quite. What I would want us to do, and what I'm trying to do with all this stuff that I'm talking about in writing, is that we need to be out in front of this and thinking about these problems now.
For sure.
Because if we wait, it's going to be too late.
For sure.
And already the laws are being written by Zuckerberg and Sam Altman and other people like this, and it's not coming from us. Yeah. We also talked about this morning. Many things we think is an AI problem is actually a good old-fashioned capitalism problem. And we have gutted all of our antitrust and all of our regulation for a lot of corporate power, and now we're seeing the results of it. But if you blame AI, it's technological determinist thinking. It's not the AI. It's the framework we've built for these corporations to be as powerful as they are.
I enjoyed your talk very much and found it quite challenging. I'm not quite sure I have a question. I have at least some observations that might turn out to be a question. I'm sure you'll have some questions about them. First of all, I just want to say this. It seems to me the thing that you called relativism was odd in certain ways. I mean, it never contemplated, thinking of only some humans as human. We always would have to include all humans. So if you just thought of white people, that would not be acceptable. So it's it has a belief in universality and also belief in equality. So if the thing we were coming up with was we'll give this to white people but not to black people and so forth, that wouldn't work either. Right? So underlying that relativism was already a kind of absolutism. That's not to say that the same thing in every case, okay? But it's to say that you're talking about principles like equality and lack of exclusion as non-relativistic principles. They are basic moral requirements of any system that's going to adapt to the different peculiarities of different people and so on. Okay. Now, this is connected in my mind in some ways to the. It seems to me in your analysis of consciousness that you give more weight than we should to the question of determining its presence. Okay, that's obviously how Descartes made his fortune, worrying about that, and it's a very tough problem. But I don't think we should give up so quickly on consciousness, because it seems to me there's a kind of basic awareness that we could easily agree on. I mean, basically, I mean, you talked about consciousness and sentience, or you might think of it this way. Sentience is a kind of consciousness. By consciousness, I mean it's a kind of awareness. It's a way of being aware of things in the world. And then there's a kind of awareness of one's life as a life that's unfolding in time. Okay, so I think, for example, people who think, can think that it's wrong to be cruel to animals, but it's not wrong to kill them painlessly, right? Because what they have as consciousness is sensory awareness, and that includes sensitivity to pain, but it doesn't include the sense of a person unfolding in time with a future that they're looking forward to, and so forth and so on. And so I think some issues of abortion could get handled with that. But it seems to me in that sense, if you don't worry so much about the problem of detecting it, figure we'll work that out. We generally do it after all. Very few of us start talking to trees or chairs or things like that. We generally seem to do it. We seem to know it when other people are being excluded, that they're people, that they're not things, right? You didn't have any, even talking about Scooby-Doo, it's about some kind of machine. You're not talking about some human. Everybody would already agree that the person has a kind of consciousness that counts and so on. So it seems to me, if we just thought, what do we require here? It seems to me we have this two-level theory of consciousness. They both have moral consequences. Sentience has the moral consequence of avoiding pain wherever possible, and the consciousness that is aware of itself as a being in time and so on has a kind of right to life and a right to avoid cruelty and so on. And then we worry about the problem of how we determine this, and part of it is going to be, take Pascal's wager, do this by setting yourself up to make the fewest kinds of mistakes. And then it seems to me you could be back with the consciousness thing, and it seems to me it fits lots of things that we talk about. They take the form of what it is, determining how to treat it, as opposed to how we treat it, determining what it is. I mean, if we think about the rights of women, it's basically realizing that, they're not different in the morally relevant way from men. So that's an ontology thing. And from that ontology thing, you realize that they have to have the same rights. It seems to me the same thing with whites and blacks. Okay.
Can we wrap up the questions because we have to get one more person to talk?
Okay. Well, so that's my question. What do you say about that?
And then we just ask if Professor Buck would like to add something, and then maybe you can take them together and say whatever you'd like, and then we can end the session.
I'll see if I can mash them together. Okay.
Okay. Would you mind?
Maybe.
Actually, I can just dovetail on that because one of the things I had in mind was just to kind of put some pressure on the distinction you're raising between status versus relational, which I think follows on what you were saying. I'm curious, it seems to me, especially on the first example you gave, referencing those 5 indigenous scholars, it wasn't so much the case that relational replaced status, but rather relational assumed a prior status always already granted.
Correct.
That allowed for it.
Yeah.
So the dichotomy seems like it falls in some sense because
I'm not trying to make a dichotomy.
They're members of a kin before they could be a certain kind of member of a kin.
No. So I think one of the things that comes out of this presentation, because I don't have the time to get into the nuance of the book, is I don't think the relational ethics and the properties approach are a binary. I don't think it's an either or. I think the relational approach provides a better description of what we were already doing with properties. Properties are a heuristic. Once we bump into enough things that look like us, then we take a shortcut, and that shortcut is consciousness. so that consciousness becomes a heuristic and not a qualifying metaphysical state.
See, I really disagree with that. I mean, consciousness is important because it's how you hurt people. It's what they care about. That's what we ought to be looking at. If people care about pain and they care about the life they're living, and all the bad things that you can do are violations of one or the other of that, and that's ontology comes first. It's a kind of being that is subject to suffering and so forth and so on, and that worked for the rights of black people, it worked for the rights of women. It seems to me the ontological thing, the non-relativist thing, is where we're in fact headed. It's what those relations are doing. Those relations presuppose a theory about what the person is that accounts for why they have those rights.
All right. Thank you so much for everybody for coming today. We have to end it at that. It is 1 past. So thank you, Dr. Gunkel, for your.